Hey guys, tonight we're rowing straight into the most eyebrow-raising, mead-soaked, and fur-blanketed corners of history, the world of Viking raiders. No, not the cheesy movie Vikings with chiseled abs and suspiciously good dental hygiene. I'm talking about real Viking raiders, the ones who had more fleas than morals, sailed wooden bathtubs across the North Sea, and whose greatest romantic fantasy was probably a night without lice. Before we lower the sails, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this type of nonsense. Drop a comment to let me know where you're listening from and if you, too, have ever tried to seduce someone using only a turnip and a death glare. Now, dim the lights, switch on your fan for that cozy Arctic breeze, tuck yourself into bed, and, if you're brave, slip into your scratchiest wool blanket. Let's set the scene. Have you ever wondered if Vikings really spent all their time pillaging and plundering, or were they sometimes just desperately trying to impress someone with their collection of walrus teeth? Did they actually sweep up the maidens after battle? Or did they mostly get rejected by Scandinavian peasants with higher standards than you'd think? Was their love life full of wild Norse passion, or more like awkward attempts at flirting while covered in cod oil? And what was the Viking version of swiping right? Was it just grunting and offering a goat? Congratulations! You've just woken up 1200 years ago, somewhere on the damp edge of a longhouse, in a world where deodorant is a myth, privacy is a distant dream, and the next sound you hear might be a war horn or your neighbour's romantic advances. Good luck. Welcome to the Viking bedroom, otherwise known as the corner of the longhouse your goat hasn't claimed. Forget about romantic candlelight and privacy. Here, you're sharing a single smoky, hay-filled room with your entire family, a pile of livestock, and half the village's gossip. Nothing says passion like someone's uncle loudly snoring 6 inches away. Let's set the scene. It's late evening in Scandinavia, around 879 AD. The wind outside is howling like a wolf with tax problems, and the only thing between you and the frosty night air is a wall made of timber, mud, and pure optimism. There are no private bedrooms, no locks on doors, not even a curtain to hide behind. If you want some me time, you'd better invent the concept, and fast. The Viking longhouse is basically one big group sleepover, except no one leaves and everyone smells like dried fish. You stumble over a chicken, sidestep your cousin's muddy boots, and try to carve out a patch of straw for yourself. Your bed is a pile of hay layered with slightly greasy furs, all of which contain more wildlife than you'd like to think about. If you're lucky, you might get a corner near the wall. Just ignore the draft, the rats, and the fact that someone carved mysterious runes there last week. If you're unlucky, you're in the middle, surrounded on all sides by family members with digestive problems and an elderly goat who does not respect boundaries. Now, let's talk about the ambience. Modern bedrooms are sold on peace and quiet. The Viking longhouse is marketed on volume and scent. There's a fire burning somewhere in the middle of the room, the smoke rising up to a hole in the roof, unless the wind changes, in which case the smoke rises directly into your face. Coughing is less a symptom and more a group activity. The air is thick with the aromas of wood smoke, old cabbage, animal sweat, and an ever-present hint of mildew. Scented candles? Please. The only thing burning here is your hope for a good night's sleep. But what about romance, you ask? Let's say you somehow catch the eye of a special someone across the crowded hay pile. The best you can do is awkwardly shuffle your straw closer and whisper sweet nothings while your grandmother loudly critiques your posture. Privacy is a theoretical concept. If you think you're being discreet, you're not. There are at least 6 pairs of eyes watching, 3 human, 3 belonging to the family sheep. And don't even think about sneaking off to the barn for a secret rendezvous. That's where your little brother sleeps, and he will absolutely blackmail you for extra porridge in the morning. Need some alone time? Good luck. Even at night, the longhouse is a circus. Someone is always getting up to tend the fire. Someone else is singing a lullaby to the baby. And, for reasons you'll never understand, your Uncle Bjorn insists on practicing his poetry at midnight. Plus, Livestock don't sleep on your schedule. Chickens rustle, pigs snort, and the cow occasionally adds commentary that would make a sailor blush. And then there's the issue of bedding. Forget memory foam. Your mattress is a sack of straw, your blanket is a scratchy wool cloak, and your pillow is whatever didn't run away when you tried to grab it. If you roll over in your sleep, you risk starting a domino effect of limbs and livestock. Waking up in a dog pile is basically the Viking alarm clock. But hey, it wasn't all misery. The lack of privacy meant everyone knew each other's business. But it also built a weird, noisy sense of community. Family bonds were literally forged in the fire and smoke of these crowded nights. If you survived the snoring, you could survive anything. So next time you complain about sharing a bed or someone stealing your side of the blanket, remember, at least you're not fighting a goose for personal space while 50 relatives pretend not to notice. In the Viking world, passion was fleeting, but togetherness was inescapable. Sleep tight. Or at least, try. You might think Vikings seduced with smouldering looks and rippling muscles. In reality, the smell did most of the work. Bath day was Saturday, if you were lucky, and the cologne of choice was a robust blend of cod oil and despair. If anyone got close enough for romance, it was either true love or a tragic loss of smell. Let's be honest. When you imagine a Viking, you probably picture a windswept hero, golden hair billowing, skin glistening heroically. Now, delete that image and replace it with a sleep-deprived farmer who hasn't changed his tunic since the last equinox. Because for the average Norseman or woman, hygiene was a matter of practicality, not passion. Bathing was reserved for special occasions, like weddings, religious holidays, or that magical Saturday when the sun shone, the river thawed, and you were in a mood for risky behavior, like voluntarily taking off your layers in front of everyone you know. Here's the good news. Compared to some of their medieval neighbours, Vikings were shockingly into cleanliness. They even had a word for their weekly wash, lagerdaga, or washing day, which eventually became Saturday. The bad news: cleanliness was a relative term. Most washing involved standing knee-deep in an icy stream, scrubbing yourself with sand, animal fat, and whatever passed for soap. If you were feeling extra fancy, you might heat up some water over the fire and squeeze yourself into a barrel or a wooden tub. But let's not get carried away. There was still no indoor plumbing, no privacy, and absolutely no loofahs. Now, if you're hoping to impress a prospective partner, it helps to be creative. Soap was made from animal fat mixed with ashes, creating a gritty grey paste that doubled as a medieval exfoliant and an excellent way to lose your eyebrows. After scrubbing off the week's dirt, you'd anoint yourself with whatever oils or animal greases were available. Cod oil was a favourite. It was plentiful, it had a certain shine, and it definitely covered up the smell of whatever you'd stepped in. The only drawback was the aroma, which can best be described as haunted seafood market. But in the hierarchy of Viking courtship, being greasy was preferable to being outright mouldy. Let's not forget about hair care. Vikings were surprisingly fond of combs, small, carved from bone, and passed down for generations, possibly as a punishment. You would untangle your hair, beard, and whatever else was growing on your body, picking out fleas, nits, and the occasional stowaway beetle. If you really wanted to go the extra mile, you could braid your hair with bits of coloured thread or beads. The effect was striking, equal parts, wild beauty, and public health warning. And what about mouth hygiene? Vikings weren't chewing mint gum, but some evidence suggests they at least rinsed with water and sometimes chewed twigs to clean their teeth. If that sounds primitive, remember, it's better than nothing, and most people by age 30 had fewer teeth to worry about anyway. But all this effort at personal grooming could only go so far in a world where your daily chores included mucking out stables and boiling down fish heads. By the time you'd finished your wash, you were probably dirtier than when you started. Plus, your neighbours were always watching. Want to bathe in privacy? Good luck. The nearest screen was a pile of damp straw, and the family pig was not a polite bystander. As for romance, Let's just say expectations were different. If someone invited you for a walk by the fjord, it wasn't a subtle signal. It was a test of whether you could tolerate their musk for more than 15 minutes. Bathing was in its own way an act of hope, a fresh start for love, or at least an attempt to scrape off last week's mistakes. So, next time you complain about a partner's choice of cologne, remember the Vikings, people who believed in second chances, cod oil, and the possibility that love can bloom anywhere, even in the pungent haze of a crowded longhouse on washing day. If someone leaned in for a kiss, you knew it was real, or that their nose had finally surrendered. Getting dressed for a night out meant piling on every tunic, cloak, and fur you owned. Seduction involved more unfastening than a tent at Burning Man. Nothing sets the mood quite like wrestling with 12 layers of itchy wool while muttering apologies about the smell. Let's talk Viking fashion. You might picture fierce raiders in windswept cloaks, their furs billowing heroically as they stride through the mead hall, eyes smouldering with Norse mystique. In reality, Viking seduction was less fashion runway and more mobile laundry basket. The rule of thumb: if you own it, you wear it. Simultaneously. Cold weather, sea spray, and the absence of reliable heating meant you basically lived in a permanent cocoon of increasingly lumpy layers. Start with the basics. Your first layer was a linen undertunic, theoretically white but practically a shade of used butter churn. On top of that went a woolen tunic, scratchy, warm, and stiff enough to stand on its own in a strong breeze. Trousers were usually tied up with cords, which made undressing in a hurry an exercise in both patience and knot theory. Add to this a cloak for warmth, and then, for special occasions, every fur you could get your hands on. Seal, bear, fox, sheep. If it had a pulse and lost it, it could become a Viking's outerwear. Now, imagine trying to catch the eye of your crush across a smoky hall. You saunter over, attempting what you think is a smouldering glance, only for your hood to slip down over your nose. You attempt to strike a pose, but your layers creak, and your cloak snags on someone's dinner. Vikings didn't have zippers, buttons, or Velcro, just ties, pins, and enough decorative brooches to set off every airport metal detector for centuries. Flirting involved a lot of smiling, some light sheep-related banter, and the constant hope that your underlayers hadn't bunched up in unflattering places. Should you be lucky enough to attract some attention, the process of seduction moved to phase 2, the great unwrapping. This was a test of stamina, dexterity, and the ability to keep a straight face while getting tangled in your own drawstrings. There's a reason why Viking romance often started with, "Can you help me with this knot?" It wasn't a euphemism, it was a logistical necessity. Every layer removed revealed another, increasingly questionable relic of winter survival. By the time you'd gotten down to your evening linens, everyone involved had broken a sweat and lost interest at least twice. It didn't help that the materials themselves were not exactly sensual. Wool, after months of wear, acquired a sort of sentience. Furs might be luxurious, but only if you didn't mind occasional ticks and the lingering smell of the animal's last meal. Underclothes were rare, usually optional, and often reserved for the rich or the fastidious. The average Viking's idea of sexy underwear was the part that itches least. Laundry, such as it was, happened infrequently and usually involved a river, a lot of soap made from ashes and animal fat, and the hope that nothing floated away. So, the seduction scene was completed by a subtle aroma of wet sheep and historical struggle. If you managed to undress without accidentally smothering your partner in a stray pelt, it was considered a good omen. But here's the wild thing. In Viking society, clothes really did matter. Beautiful embroidery, bright colours. Yes, they had colours. And fancy brooches were signals of status, skill, and suitability. If you showed up in a clean tunic with a little gold thread, you were basically a rock star. Seduction was as much about showing off your handiwork and your access to imported dyes as it was about actual chemistry. So next time you grumble about changing for date night, spare a thought for the Vikings. Masters of uncomfortable layering, champions of the awkward undress, and survivors of seduction attempts, where "let me help you with that knot" was the ultimate icebreaker. In a world where every outfit weighed as much as a sheepdog, true love wasn't just blind, it was patient, persistent, and only mildly itchy. Viking flirting wasn't subtle. It often involved poetry that sounded suspiciously like threats, and gifts that ranged from beautiful jewelry to the tooth of a recently defeated enemy. "Here's a bracelet, and also, please don't stab my cousin." Let's be honest, the Viking approach to courtship made modern dating apps look downright civilized. While you might nervously draft a text message and overthink your emoji choices, the average Viking just had to choose between reciting a saga about slaying a dragon or actually slaying something and bringing back a piece as proof. And nothing said "I'm into you" like a bloody wolf pelt dropped at your feet before breakfast. Vikings were a people of action, but also of words, sometimes terrifying words. Poetry was a powerful tool of seduction, and the Norse loved a good skaldic verse, preferably one that rhymed, referenced the gods, and made at least one thinly veiled threat against your rivals. There's nothing quite like a poem that begins, "Your beauty strikes me as the spear of Odin strikes my enemies," and ends with a promise to raid the neighbors if you say no. Sincerity was measured by the number of metaphors per stanza and how many people blushed, laughed, or quietly reached for their swords. Gifts were a huge part of the ritual. You didn't just show up empty-handed. No, you brought something with meaning, an amber bead, a polished shell, maybe a silver arm ring, or, for those with limited resources and a flair for drama, a tooth, ideally not your own. Jewelry was a favorite, but so were useful items like combs, knives, or, if you were really smitten, a small chest of imported soap, the Norse equivalent of a luxury spa day. If you wanted to impress, you made sure your gift told a story. This comb? Made from the bone of the whale that washed up last spring. You're welcome. It still smells faintly of the sea and despair. But beware, Viking courtship was never without its hazards. There were always rivals. If someone else fancied the same person, things could get complicated very quickly. Suitors might duel, either in a friendly, performative way involving wrestling and slightly melodramatic groaning, or in a slightly less friendly way involving axes and sudden dramatic poetry recitals. Nothing spices up romance like the looming threat of having to avenge your own pickup line. And the families? Oh, they got involved too. Forget about swiping right and meeting up for coffee. Viking relationships were public business. Parents, siblings, and extended relatives all had opinions and weren't shy about sharing them. Proving yourself meant not just wooing your crush, but also surviving their father's glare and answering at least 3 riddles from their grandmother. If you were lucky, the family would invite you to join them in a meal of boiled fish, followed by an evening of competitive saga telling. If you were unlucky, you'd be issued a polite warning not to lose any more fingers at the dinner table. And just to add an extra layer of anxiety, the Norse legal system was watching too. Promises made during courtship could be binding. If you gave a gift and recited a poem, you might be on the hook for marriage whether you remembered it the next morning or not. Backing out was a legal minefield. People were fined, shamed, or occasionally chased out of town with, you guessed it, more poetry. Of course, not every courtship ended in bloodshed or betrothal. Sometimes, things just fizzled out, often after an especially awkward gift exchange. You brought me a goat's foot? How thoughtful, I think. But when romance did blossom, it tended to be robust, full of stories, sagas, and at least one near-death experience. Because in the Viking world, love wasn't just a battlefield. It was an open invitation to battlefields everywhere. Sleep tight and watch for flying combs. Forget romance. Most marriages were carefully arranged by parents who judged eligibility by land, cows, and the size of someone's battle axe. Your wedding vows might be the first words you ever said to your new spouse. Nice to meet you, I guess. Is that your goat or mine? If you grew up watching romantic comedies where people meet cute in bakeries and fall in love over misunderstandings about croissants, Viking society might seem like a horror movie. In the Norse world, marriage wasn't about soulmates or destiny. It was more about strategic alliances, moving property around, and making sure your parents didn't lose the family sheep to the neighbors. Falling in love was optional. Having a solid herd of cattle? Mandatory. Here's how it worked. Two families, possibly living miles apart and already suspicious of each other, would start sniffing around for eligible matches. This had less to do with starry-eyed teenagers and more to do with who owned the best grazing rights. Was your father a landholder with a reputation for only mildly excessive violence? Did your family own at least one cow that hadn't mysteriously vanished in the night? Great. You were suddenly hot property. Once negotiations began, things got intense. Fathers would sit down, weapons uncomfortably close at hand, and hash out the important stuff. How much land would be combined, what each side would bring as a dowry, and whether your cousin's reputation for accidentally burning down barns was likely to affect the bride price. The size of one's axe, by the way, was not just a metaphor. Literally, people would glance under the table to check for a really good weapon, just in case talks broke down and someone needed to renegotiate. For young Vikings, the romantic build-up to marriage was, let's say, brisk. You might catch a glimpse of your intended at a feast, across a crowded longhouse, or in the foggy haze of a springtime cattle market. If you were lucky, your parents might point them out from a distance. That one there, with the thick eyebrows and suspiciously nice boots, that's your future. And that would be the highlight of your courtship. The actual matchmaking could be complex. Sometimes, family, friends, or go-betweens would get involved, passing messages like, "Are you interested in marrying my second eldest son? He only lost 2 fingers last winter." Mothers, especially, would engage in subtle sabotage, spreading rumors about rival families, extolling the virtues of their own offspring, strong teeth, very few boils, and generally turning the village into a network of high-stakes gossip. When the terms were finally agreed, there was usually a public announcement, sometimes at a feast, sometimes shouted from the roof, just to make sure everyone knew the deal was sealed and no one could back out without causing a blood feud. The betrothed couple, meanwhile, would meet, exchange awkward glances, and try to guess what the other smelled like under all those layers. Your first conversation was probably about livestock, or possibly the weather, if things got spicy. Was there any room for feelings? Occasionally. Some couples grew fond of each other after years of sharing a bed, a barn, and a mutual distrust of their in-laws. Others treated marriage as a long-term business merger, where affection was secondary to keeping the pigs fed and the neighbors from raiding your barley stores. Love was a bonus, like finding an extra turnip at the bottom of the bin. The wedding itself was less about romance and more about paperwork, if your paperwork was a sword, and the notary was also your cousin. Witnesses were required to make everything official, dowries exchanged hands, and gifts, mostly practical, rarely sentimental, were doled out. Then came the feast, barrels of mead, roasted animals, and an unspoken agreement to avoid mentioning anyone's ex. After the ceremony, the newlyweds might finally have a few private moments together, awkward, hopeful, and mostly spent sorting out who snored the loudest and whether anyone remembered to close the goat pen. In a world where marriage was a business transaction, romance was what you made of it. Sometimes, with luck and patience, that arrangement grew into something like love, or at least a partnership where no one tried to steal your socks. So, the next time you fret about your in-laws meddling in your love life, remember, at least they didn't choose your spouse based on livestock and axe-wielding ability. In the Viking world, the heart may have been secondary, but the herd was forever. Viking weddings were less about true love and more about surviving the feast without blacking out or being trampled by a drunken uncle. Marital bliss began with spilled mead, terrible singing, and at least one fight over a roasted pig. Let's set the mood. You've made it through the high-stakes parental negotiations. You're now betrothed to someone you've maybe spoken to twice, and now it's time for the big event. Forget about white dresses, church bells, or meaningful glances under garlands of roses. The Viking wedding was an all-out communal affair, equal parts legal ceremony, food fight, and test of personal endurance. If you made it to the end of the night, still married, fully clothed, and not banned from your spouse's village, you were already beating the odds. Preparation began early, sometimes days in advance, especially if someone needed to sober up enough to find the pig. The whole settlement was invited, along with a few random travellers, and, inevitably, that one cousin who nobody could remember inviting but who always managed to find the mead barrel first. The house was scrubbed, in theory, the best furs were hung up for show, and the couple's family tried to hide any goats with a reputation for disruptive behaviour. The goal was to impress, or at least not disgrace, all present, a tall order in a world where the family dog was probably wearing your wedding cloak. The actual ceremony was short and shockingly practical. Vows were exchanged in front of witnesses, with the gods called in for backup. If you were fancy, you might even have a priestess or gothy presiding, pouring out a little mead for the ancestors and making sure the legal documents, possibly an engraved piece of driftwood, were properly witnessed. The most important part was the hand-fasting, where the couple's hands were tied together, usually with a strip of cloth or a braided cord, symbolizing unity, mutual respect, and the shared burden of remembering each other's birthdays. Then came the feast, which was the true test of marital mettle. Tables groaned under platters of roast meats, breads, cheeses, and a suspiciously gelatinous pudding that everyone politely ignored. If you were rich, there might be imported spices. If not, your main flavour options were burnt and mysterious. The mead flowed like a river in flood season, and as the mugs emptied, inhibitions vanished. Toasts were made, some of which involved thinly veiled threats. May your mother-in-law always have cold feet, but never in my bed. And the singing began, off-key, enthusiastic, and entirely unstoppable. It wasn't long before chaos reigned. No Viking wedding was complete without at least one brawl. Sometimes it was a genuine grudge match. Sometimes just two uncles wrestling over the last piece of boar. The bride and groom were expected to keep smiling, eat something, and not cry when someone inevitably spilled mead down their best tunic. There was dancing too, which in Viking terms meant rhythmic stomping, hand claps, and the occasional collision with a wall. If your partner didn't step on your foot at least once, were you even really married? In between all this, the couple snuck away for the bedding, a public, and sometimes literal, event in which witnesses escorted the pair to their marital bed, made jokes at their expense, and sometimes offered helpful tips. Don't forget which knot you used on the cloak. Privacy, as always, was an optional feature of Viking life, so most couples started their wedded bliss in a haze of embarrassment, laughter, and animal noises from the adjoining room. Through it all, anxiety simmered beneath the surface. Was the dowry big enough? Did the bread rise? Would your new spouse snore louder than your Uncle Thorvald? Yet somehow, beneath the noise, spilled drinks and bruised egos, the wedding worked. For a brief moment, the entire community gathered to support two people about to try this whole marriage thing. Not for love at first sight, but for survival, alliances, and maybe, eventually, a little affection. So, next time you're at a wedding and the DJ is terrible or the cake is dry, remember the Vikings, people who believed a good feast could solve almost any problem, except for the one caused by that uncle who never knows when to leave. In the end, marital bliss was less about romance and more about making it through the night, together, if slightly tipsy, with only minor injuries and most of your dignity intact. The Viking honeymoon. One night in a hayloft, 3 nights listening to your in-laws argue, and a lifetime of wondering if the family cow is judging you. Nothing says romance like being serenaded by the sound of someone vomiting in the next room. Let's be honest, if you're picturing a Viking honeymoon as a dreamy escape to a candlelit fjord, think again. There were no romantic getaways, no fancy inns with honeymoon suites, and definitely no rose petals scattered on the bed unless a goat wandered through carrying flowers. Your first official night together as a married couple was less about privacy and more about avoiding the wandering chickens and your grandmother's curious stare. The longhouse had about as much privacy as a crowded subway car, and roughly the same level of background noise. So where did you and your new spouse go to celebrate your nuptials? Tradition dictated a quick shuffle to the nearest hayloft, possibly while the wedding feast was still in full swing. Don't mind us, just heading out for some fresh air. With luck, you'd snag a hayloft with at least a little distance from the main barn, but you were never really alone. Somewhere nearby, a cousin was always looking for a lost shoe, a sheep was eating your bouquet, and your little brother was lurking in the shadows, plotting his next prank. Romance, in this context, meant hoping your new spouse wasn't allergic to straw or sudden farm animal-related noises. If you did find a moment of peace, you were probably so exhausted from the wedding feast that the best you could manage was a mutual agreement to collapse and deal with the intricacies of married life when you both had less mead in your bloodstream. Forget silk nightgowns and whispered sweet nothings. You were still picking breadcrumbs out of your hair, and your wedding cloak was doubling as a pillow. If you wanted ambience, you got a distant chorus of snoring relatives, a few argumentative geese, and the subtle, ever-present fragrance of hay and cow. And then, just when you think you've achieved a moment of wedded bliss, someone throws open the barn door to check if you need more mead. Privacy in Viking culture was a community event. Your friends and family considered it their sacred duty to tease you mercilessly, offer unsolicited advice. Don't forget to feed the chickens. And occasionally, if they'd had enough to drink, start chanting embarrassing songs about the wedding night. If you survived the first night without being interrupted, you were already outperforming the historical average. But the real challenge began after the hayloft. For the next several days, you and your spouse were expected to be seen, preferably together, at every meal, gathering, and family argument. The in-laws would assess your teamwork as you hauled water, chopped wood, or tried to find a moment to discuss what to name your first goat. Awkward silences were inevitable. Sometimes you discovered your spouse snored like a berserker, or insisted on sleeping with a battle axe just in case. Sometimes you found you both had the same favorite sheep, leading to tense negotiations about shared custody. True intimacy, Viking style, was learning to communicate through a series of meaningful glances while pretending you couldn't hear the ongoing debate about who actually owned the nicest drinking horn. By the end of your so-called honeymoon, you'd survived a crash course in Viking marriage. No privacy, no breaks, and no illusions that life was going to be simple. If you were lucky, you discovered you could laugh together, especially when the cow gave you that judgmental look or your little brother tied your tunics together in the night. Sometimes, somewhere between hayloft disasters and in-law squabbles, you even found a glimmer of affection. So, next time someone boasts about their luxury honeymoon, remember the Viking newlyweds, pioneers in making the best of awkward silences, farmyard serenades, and marital teamwork in the face of relentless community involvement. In the Viking world, romance was less about candlelight and more about solidarity, endurance, and learning to find the funny side of everything, especially when the family cow was the only witness to your romantic getaway. You've heard the legends, Vikings ravishing maidens on every shore. The reality? The sagas are a little more ambiguous. Turns out, most raiding was just stealing stuff, then complaining about how cold it was. As for the wild orgies, more like wild arguments about laundry. If you've ever watched a Hollywood Viking movie, you might be convinced that every raid ended with torchlit passion and a minor orgy set to a pounding drumbeat. In reality, the closest most Vikings got to a romantic interlude after a raid was arguing over whose turn it was to patch the holes in the longship. The Norse sagas, the historical Netflix of the Viking world, are suspiciously silent on the topic of wild group escapades, preferring instead to focus on the thrilling details of family feuds, sheep stealing, and why Uncle Snorri was banned from 3 neighbouring villages. It's true that the Vikings had a reputation for being forward compared to their medieval neighbours, but if you crack open the actual sagas, you'll notice a distinct lack of explicit content. The legendary ravishing scenes tend to involve more property damage than pillow talk. When Vikings landed on foreign shores, their main interests were gold, livestock, and the local cheese selection. If anyone was seduced, it was probably by a particularly nice butter churn or the idea of not freezing to death for one night. And as for the wild orgies, that's mostly a product of modern imaginations and a handful of medieval Christian chroniclers who apparently mistook Saturday night at the mead hall for a bacchanalian disaster. The truth is, most Norse communities were small, rural, and let's be honest, filled with far too many nosy relatives for anything even remotely scandalous to happen unnoticed. When your entire love life is being monitored by your grandmother and a suspicious goat, the opportunity for spontaneous group activities is severely limited. The sagas themselves are, at best, suggestive. There's flirting, to be sure, often in the form of pointed insults, competitive poetry, or someone throwing an apple across a feast hall. But when things do get spicy, the authors quickly change the subject to "and then he sailed to Iceland" or "she never spoke of that winter again." When actual sex is mentioned, it's usually either as a source of legal trouble, and then they were fined 3 cows and a bar of soap, or the start of a long-running feud that ends with at least one house burning down. In fact, if there's a recurring theme in Viking love stories, it's that passion is dangerous. Fall for the wrong person, and you might find yourself on the receiving end of a family vendetta, a poetic curse, or a surprise duel at sunrise. Far from a paradise of carefree romance, the Viking world treated sexual affairs as a potential threat to the fragile peace of the community. There were strict laws around adultery, inheritance, and who could sleep in which hayloft. Get caught breaking the rules, and you could expect everything from public shaming to outright exile, and you'd have to explain to everyone back home that you'd been banished for unlawful snuggling. And yet, for all the dry legal codes and stern poetry, the Norse still found ways to keep things interesting. Love spells, coded messages, and the occasional stolen kiss behind a woodpile do make appearances. But if you're expecting steamy details, you're out of luck. The saga writers were more interested in whether your sword was sharp and your cows were healthy. So next time you hear about Vikings partying like rock stars, remember, the real sagas were written by people who valued a good farm, a loyal spouse, and a nice quiet night by the fire. The only thing wilder than their orgies was probably the laundry pile. In the end, the most passionate thing in a Viking longhouse was usually the argument over who forgot to feed the goat. Time to get serious. Raiding did sometimes involve capturing women, but Norse society also had surprisingly strict rules about consent, property, and marriage. Most captives quickly found themselves married off, often with more legal protections than you'd expect. Still, nobody asked the goat's opinion. Let's break from the jokes for a minute, because the subject of Viking raiding and taking captives has been stretched and sensationalized for centuries, usually by people with a flair for the dramatic and no sense of historical context. Yes, it's true that when Vikings raided, they sometimes brought home captives, including women. But before you imagine a world of endless pillage and cartoonish villainy, let's look at how things really worked once everyone got home, hung up their axes, and realized the longhouse was even more crowded. Norse law and custom were not quite as lawless as pop culture would have you believe. In fact, if you landed in a Viking settlement as a captive, your fate was dictated less by your captor's mood and more by an elaborate web of family negotiations, property law, and, occasionally, actual empathy. Captives were certainly considered property at first, but the line between captive and future family member was much thinner than you might think, sometimes crossed over a single dinner of boiled turnips. Unlike in other parts of medieval Europe, Vikings couldn't simply do whatever they wanted with captives. If a man wanted to keep a woman as a wife or concubine, there were rules to follow. Real, actual rules, usually enforced by angry in-laws with very sharp farm tools. The Norse legal system, as written in the Gragas and other law codes, outlined expectations for marriage, dowries, and the status of taken women. A captive could not simply be forced into marriage without some form of agreement, at least not if you wanted your neighbors to respect you or your children to inherit anything more than a family feud. And then there was the matter of consent. For all their reputation as brutal raiders, the Vikings were astonishingly pragmatic when it came to household harmony. Consent was an ideal that, while not always reached in practice, let's be honest about the realities of early medieval warfare, was valued enough to have actual legal mechanisms. If a woman was taken captive, her new owner had to make her his wife or concubine legally, or face shaming, exile, or, worst of all, fines. And these were not small fines. We're talking sell your best cow and possibly your favorite shoes territory. In fact, being married to a Norseman came with some unexpected perks. Women, captive or free, could own property, divorce their husbands, and even reclaim their dowries if things didn't work out. Children born from these unions were usually accepted into the family and could inherit, so long as nobody threw a fit at the thing, the local assembly, which, yes, is what Vikings called their parliament. It was not a modern love story, but it was far more contractual and, weirdly, bureaucratic than you'd expect from people who ate with knives strapped to their calves. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about the arrangement. Some newcomers assimilated, learned the language, and built a life in the village. Others plotted their escape, their revenge, or simply tried to avoid doing the laundry. The reality was a weird, messy patchwork of pragmatic alliances, mutual benefit, and, in some cases, reluctant affection. All of it watched closely by the local community, who loved a bit of gossip even more than a good raid. Morality, in the Viking world, was complicated. It was possible to be both a terrifying raider and a doting spouse, sometimes in the same afternoon. The community valued order, respect for law, and the ever-important goal of keeping the peace, even if that peace included making awkward small talk over a bowl of cold porridge. So yes, Viking society was capable of great violence, but also astonishing order. Even the fate of captives was wrapped in law, expectation, and, occasionally, a grudging sense of fairness. Nobody asked the goat, of course. But if they had, the answer would probably have been to keep things simple, avoid trouble, and maybe keep the longhouse a little less crowded next time. Viking women could own land, divorce their husbands, and sometimes had more say in marriage than their counterparts elsewhere in Europe. Polyamory? Occasionally, especially if you were rich enough to afford more than one spouse and didn't mind sleeping with one eye open. Let's set aside the Hollywood image of Viking women as background characters in fur bikinis, bravely carrying trays of mead. In reality, Norse women could run a farm, manage household finances, and recite legal codes with the confidence of someone who'd seen every episode of Viking Judge Judy. If you were a woman in a Viking community, you weren't just a sidekick. You were often the backbone, the brains, and, when needed, the official yeller in any family dispute. Women in Viking society were, by early medieval standards, shockingly empowered. They could inherit property, and not just the congratulations, here's a goat and a headache kind. If a woman's husband died, she didn't get packed off to a convent or sent to live with her brother-in-law. She might take over the family farm, control its income, and become the boss of everyone, from labourers to in-laws, whether they liked it or not. And if anyone dared to challenge her right to property, she could show up at the thing, the local assembly, and make her case, sometimes more convincingly than the men. Divorce? Also surprisingly modern. If a Viking woman was unhappy in her marriage, she didn't have to resort to elaborate schemes or poisoned stew. She could simply pack up her dowry, stand at the threshold of the home, and declare in front of witnesses that the marriage was over. Bonus points if she kept the house and the good combs. No need for lawyers or bitter custody battles, just a very public breakup and maybe a little awkwardness at the next feast. When it came to marriage, Viking women weren't entirely at the mercy of their parents, either. Arranged marriages were common, but a woman's consent was considered important, at least in theory. If she was truly opposed to a match, she could make her feelings known. Of course, a lot depended on family status, community gossip, and the size of everyone's sword collection. But there are plenty of saga tales about women outwitting, out-arguing, or outright embarrassing their would-be suitors until the family gave up and found a less troublesome match. Now, about that polyamory. Technically, Viking men could have more than one wife, but only if they could afford it, and frankly, most couldn't. Multiple households meant multiple dowries, more property to divide, and the logistical nightmare of keeping all parties happy, or at least not plotting to poison your porridge. Wealthy jarls and chieftains might try their luck, but polyamory in Viking society was more likely to end in domestic chaos than blissful harmony. In practice, most marriages were strictly monogamous, probably because nobody wanted to argue over laundry with 3 other people. Viking women also had spiritual power. Some acted as seeresses or vulvas, priestesses who were equal parts fortune teller and community therapist. These women carried staffs, wore cloaks covered in magical symbols, and travelled between villages offering predictions, advice, and the occasional social commentary. If you crossed one of these women, expect your next batch of beer to mysteriously sour and your livestock to develop unexplained attitudes. Socially, women were expected to work hard, managing food stores, weaving, raising kids, and keeping the peace between feuding uncles all fell under their purview. If you were waiting for your Viking wife to bring you a beer while you lounged by the fire, you'd better hope she was in a good mood. Otherwise, you'd find yourself on dish duty for a month. Despite their relative independence, Viking women still lived in a world where power had limits. The legal codes protected them in theory, but much depended on local politics, reputation, and sheer stubbornness. Still, their voices echo through the sagas, not as helpless maidens, but as clever, courageous, and occasionally terrifying partners. So, next time you hear about the wild, lawless Viking world, remember that for every sword-wielding raider, there was a woman making sure the house didn't burn down, the debts were paid, and nobody accidentally married the wrong cousin. Polyamory? Maybe. Power and property? Absolutely, assuming you didn't mind a little drama with your morning porridge. Court cheating? Viking society did not approve. Adultery was a scandal, punishable by everything from divorce to some creative axe-based solutions. If you were clever, you might invent an excuse involving trolls, mead, and a sudden attack of amnesia. Despite what the myths might have you believe, the Viking Age wasn't a free-for-all of romantic dalliances and wild hayloft encounters. In fact, if you strayed outside your marriage, you weren't just risking an awkward breakfast, you were threatening the peace of the entire longhouse. Forget about whispered apologies or awkward text messages. In a world where everyone knew everyone else's business, and probably their laundry schedule, getting caught cheating was basically social self-immolation. Adultery was seen as more than just a private indiscretion. It was a threat to the fragile web of alliances, property, and family reputation that held Viking society together. If word got out that you were sharing more than stories by the fire, the consequences could be swift, creative, and occasionally poetic. Vikings loved a good story, but not when it involved their spouse and the neighbour's sheep trader. So what actually happened if you were caught? First, there was the shame, public and enduring. Neighbours would gossip, the thing, the local assembly, might get involved, and you could expect to be the subject of several new sagas, none of them flattering. A scorned spouse could demand a divorce right there on the threshold of the house, taking the dowry, the good goats, and, for extra emphasis, your best winter cloak. Public shaming rituals sometimes involved standing in the middle of the village and having your romantic failures recited by the resident scold, poet, who could turn a simple love triangle into an epic of humiliation. But let's say things got truly out of hand. For more egregious cases, the punishments could be as dramatic as the accusations. There are documented examples of property being divided, heads being shaved, and, in rare but legendary cases, axes being wielded in ways that were more literal than symbolic. A creative spouse might challenge you, or your lover, to a duel, or, more commonly, orchestrate an elaborate prank involving livestock and the entire extended family. The Norse legal codes didn't always specify the exact punishment for adultery, leaving plenty of room for community innovation. And then there were the excuses. You didn't just say, oops, no. Viking excuses for adultery were the stuff of legend. Some blamed enchanted mead or love spells gone wrong. Others swore they'd been bewitched by a passing troll or led astray by a mischievous spirit in the woods. A few brave souls even tried the I was sleepwalking defense, which rarely worked but always got a laugh, right before the public shaming resumed. There are saga stories of wronged husbands blaming mysterious curses, and even one tale of a woman claiming she mistook her neighbour for her husband because of identical wool cloaks and too much ale at the feast. It was dark and everyone was itchy. Defence was, if not accepted, at least understood. For all its sternness, Viking society also recognized the human tendency for chaos. In some communities, if both families could be convinced to settle things quietly, maybe with a hefty fine and a strong promise to behave, the incident would be swept under the literal hay. But if anyone felt slighted, if property or inheritance was at stake, or if the wronged party had a poetic cousin with a grudge, the story could grow into a community legend. And yet, for all the threats and consequences, affairs still happened. Vikings were, after all, human, flawed, passionate, and occasionally very bad at keeping secrets. But if you were thinking about taking that risk, you had better have a creative excuse, a solid alibi, and perhaps a spare set of tunics for a quick getaway. So the next time you're tempted by forbidden romance, remember the Vikings. For them, adultery was a risky game with high stakes, a lot of drama, and a guaranteed audience. Best to keep your cloak close, your stories straight, and your sense of humour sharper than your axe. In the Viking world, if things didn't work out, you could actually get divorced. The process was less amicable separation and more public yelling, followed by moving your stuff outside. And, of course, everyone in the longhouse would know. Divorce might sound like a modern invention, something reserved for celebrity couples and that one uncle who keeps moving back in with his mother. But the Vikings were way ahead of their time. In Norse society, marriage was a contract, and if it wasn't working, it could be cancelled, usually with much less paperwork and much more spectacle. If you ever wished you could just announce your breakup to the world and be done with it, the Vikings had you covered. All you needed was a loud voice, a few witnesses, and a willingness to air your grievances in front of your entire extended family and their goats. The rules were surprisingly clear. Both men and women could initiate divorce, and neither needed to hire a lawyer or prove fault. All you had to do was declare your intention to end the marriage in front of witnesses, preferably at the threshold of your shared home, with at least 2 people to vouch that you'd said it out loud. For added drama, you could repeat this declaration at 3 different doorways, just to make sure nobody missed the memo. Bonus points if you did it during mealtime, for maximum disruption. Of course, it wasn't all as simple as shouting, "I'm out," and riding off into the sunset. There was still plenty of room for drama. Disputes about property, dowries, and who got to keep the dog, or the slightly used drinking horn, could get heated. The unlucky neighbours were often dragged in as referees, and the entire community took the opportunity to weigh in on who was at fault, who was better off single, and which spouse would be snapped up again by next Thursday's feast. If you were the one being dumped, it could be a hit to your reputation, but it wasn't the end of the world. Vikings believed in second, and occasionally third, chances. Divorced women in particular could return to their families, reclaim their dowries, and, if they played their cards right, find a new match within months. Divorced men might sulk for a while, but were equally likely to bounce back. The real losers were the local skalds, poets, who had to update all their family trees and rewrite several awkward verses. Naturally, the gossip never really died down. Every neighbor, cousin, and livestock dealer would have an opinion on your split, and your former in-laws might turn your failed marriage into a cautionary tale for generations to come. Don't end up like Bjorn and Astrid. Remember the hayloft incident of '86. Even so, the stigma was nowhere near as intense as it would be in later medieval Europe. After all, everyone knew someone who had tried marriage and found it wanting. Sometimes love faded, sometimes goats wandered off, and sometimes your spouse snored so loudly that even the gods were offended. As for the division of property, Norse law was oddly practical. Each party took their original possessions, and any joint property was split according to custom, not personal vendettas, though a little creative accounting was not unheard of. Children usually stayed with the mother, especially if they were still young, but arrangements could be made, preferably without resorting to kidnapping or challenging your ex to a duel over the butter churn. Sometimes, divorce even came with a touch of humor. Saga stories tell of couples who parted ways with a handshake and a joke, promising to return each other's favorite combs if they were ever found. Others ended less amicably, with one spouse flinging old boots out the door and the other threatening to take the cat hostage. So, if you're picturing Viking life as a world of grim, unbreakable vows, think again. Norse relationships were resilient, adaptable, and rarely dull. If you wanted out, you could get out, and probably end up the subject of next week's village gossip. In the end, divorce was just another chapter in the saga. Sometimes happily ever after meant sleeping alone with your own goat, and that was perfectly fine. The sagas are suspiciously silent on same-sex relationships. Historians argue, but let's just say that Vikings probably cared less about the specifics, and more about who was taking out the trash. If you wanted to keep it private, you had 1,000 miles of icy wilderness for that. Let's be clear. If you crack open a Viking saga hoping for passionate tales of same-sex romance, you'll mostly find stories about axes, honor, and sheep-related feuds. The Norse were great at chronicling drama, but when it came to love between men or between women, the record is, at best, cryptic. Scholars have spent years picking apart runes and riddles, trying to decode whether two heroes were just very good friends, or Viking good friends, if you know what I mean. It's not that same-sex relationships never happened. Statistically speaking, you can't have hundreds of years of long, lonely winters, cramped longhouses, and communal bathing without at least some sparks flying between people of the same gender. But if these relationships existed, they were rarely immortalized in writing. The sagas preferred to focus on battles, legal disputes, and the sort of family drama that makes Thanksgiving dinner look tame by comparison. That's not to say there were no clues. Old Norse law codes contain references to unmanly behavior, often in the context of insults or disputes. In fact, calling a man arger, unmanly, effeminate, or passive in same-sex acts was considered a grave insult, bad enough to justify a duel to the death. But as for actual prosecutions, they're pretty rare. Viking society seemed to care more about reputation, honor, and who was responsible for feeding the goats than about policing private affections. So, if you were subtle, or if you were just really good at chopping wood, most people probably looked the other way. Privacy, after all, was not exactly a Viking specialty, but the sheer scale of the landscape helped. If you wanted to keep a relationship under wraps, you could always go for a very long walk, say 100 miles through the snow, and have a private conversation with someone you trusted. No one was going to follow you. They were too busy trying to keep their fingers from freezing off. For Viking women, the record is even murkier. There are hints in some sagas and later folk stories about close female friendships, shared beds, and passionate poetry. But again, the writers usually faded to black just as things were getting interesting. It's entirely possible that same-sex relationships among women were simply considered part of the fabric of life, no more worth mentioning than who borrowed the best wool comb or who could outdrink the local blacksmith. If you were caught up in a same-sex relationship and someone did find out, what then? The likely outcome depended on your status, your allies, and your ability to keep people's mouths busy with mead and gossip about someone else. Viking society was shockingly pragmatic. What mattered most was fulfilling your duties, keeping the farm running, and showing up to defend the village if a raid was on the horizon. If you did all that, you could be a bit different as long as you didn't embarrass the family in public. Of course, things could turn sour if there were disputes over inheritance, insults traded at the thing, or, heaven forbid, someone started composing slanderous verses. Reputation was everything, so discretion was golden. But in the icy north, where the days were short and the nights endless, companionship of any kind was welcome, and the specifics were less important than surviving the winter with your sanity and your livestock intact. So, if you're imagining the Vikings as either wild progressives or ruthless moralists, the truth is, as always, somewhere in the middle. The sagas may be silent, but the silences are telling. At the end of the day, Norse society cared less about who you loved and more about whether you remembered to bring in the firewood. And if anyone did object, well, there was always another fjord to disappear into, or a conveniently long voyage to Ireland. In the north, love was what you made it, unwritten, unrecorded, and as private or public as you dared. Need help in the romance department? Norse herbalists had a solution for everything. Mysterious teas, animal bits, and enough dubious ingredients to make a modern pharmacist weep. Success rates were not published. Let's be real, dating has never been easy. But in the Viking Age, when your competition included brawny blacksmiths, sword-wielding poets, and the odd charming sheep farmer, you might have been tempted to seek a little herbal advantage. Luckily for you, or unluckily depending on the side effects, there was always a local wise woman, or vulva, ready to mix up something that would help nudge fate along. These potion makers weren't just dealing with love, of course. They treated headaches, broken bones, and the unfortunate results of raiding the neighbor's pantry. But love magic? That was the stuff of legends. If you were hoping to win someone's heart, or just convince them to overlook your lack of cows and your unfortunate haircut, you could pay a visit to the local herbalist and leave with a pouch of, well, let's call it romantic potential. The recipes for Viking love potions ranged from mildly alarming to downright stomach-churning. Some were basic. A tea made from wildflowers and honey, meant to be slipped into a prospective sweetheart's mead cup. Others were more experimental, involving everything from dried animal hearts to the ashes of a burnt comb. If you ever wondered who first decided to mix onions, bear fat, and a dash of moss together in the name of passion, the answer is someone with nothing to lose. And there was always the magical element. Herbs like yarrow, mugwort, and angelica were believed to have special powers, especially if harvested at dawn while reciting a string of increasingly complex Norse curses. If you were especially serious, you could visit a burial mound and collect grave dirt, because nothing says "be mine" like the spiritual residue of your ancestors. Of course, these potions were best taken with a large pinch of skepticism and maybe a slice of bread to soak up the aftertaste. The side effects included, but were not limited to, fits of laughter, sudden sleepiness, and, in at least one saga, a powerful urge to run away and become a fisherman. If your target did fall for you, it was never clear whether it was the potion, the power of suggestion, or just a shared appreciation for the herbalist's storytelling. There were, of course, more practical remedies as well. Garlic for confidence, apples for fertility, honey to sweeten the tongue, just in case your poetry needed all the help it could get. A splash of strong-smelling oil, cod liver if you were traditional, to make sure your presence was noticed at the next feast, though not always in a good way. Some herbalists even suggested keeping a bit of iron hidden in your clothes to ward off rival lovers, though this mostly worked if the rival lovers were superstitious or allergic to laundry. And just to add another layer of complexity, it was widely believed that spells worked best if you actually believed in them. The real magic, after all, was probably psychological. If you thought you were irresistible, you might actually walk across the longhouse with enough swagger to make someone curious. Confidence, plus the faint aroma of thyme and questionable animal fats, was a powerful combination. Sometimes, these magical matchmakers got results. Marriages were made, babies were born, and at least one goat was named after a famous love potion incident. It's in the footnotes of the sagas, somewhere. Sometimes, nothing happened. And the only lasting effect was an upset stomach and a new appreciation for the reliability of arranged marriages. So next time you see a dating app promising science-based compatibility, remember the Vikings, people who trusted in the power of plants, a bit of poetry, and the hope that nobody would notice the slightly green tint to their teeth. Love might not have been guaranteed, but at least you'd never lack for a story, or an excuse for why your date suddenly started quoting poetry at the full moon. Nature's dating apps. Unpredictable, occasionally effective, and always entertaining. Want to steal someone's heart? Try a love spell, assuming you don't mind risking a visit from a vengeful witch or, worse, the village gossip. If your target started acting strangely, everyone just blamed the elves. Love and magic have always been a dangerous mix, and in the Viking world, the lines between flirtation, witchcraft, and catastrophic life decisions were blurrier than a mead-soaked vision quest. If you were feeling unlucky in love, and ordinary romantic gestures, like animal bones or awkward poetry, weren't working, you could always visit the local vulva, a mysterious, slightly intimidating woman skilled in the magical arts. Every village had at least one, and most also had a backup, just in case the first one was feuding with your grandmother. Casting a love spell in Norse society wasn't as simple as lighting a candle and whispering sweet nothings. No, Viking love spells were full productions, complete with chanting, rune carving, and a laundry list of ingredients that ranged from foraged on a midnight walk to questionable even by early medieval standards. Want to ensure someone fell madly in love with you? Be prepared to collect hair clippings, animal teeth, or even a splash of your own blood. If nothing else, it kept the suitors with commitment issues away. One classic magical tool was the rune, a system of carved symbols believed to channel mystical power. You could carve runes into sticks, bones, or even bread, then secretly slip them into your target's food or drink. Sometimes, just drawing the right rune on your hand was believed to make you more appealing. If your date stared at your palm for too long, you'd know they were either under your spell or just confused by your handwriting. Herbs and objects held power too. A bundle of yarrow or mugwort tucked under a pillow might bring romantic dreams, while a ribbon tied with 3 knots could bind a lover's heart. And if you really wanted to make things interesting, you could recite a golder, a magical chant, while spinning in a circle and trying not to trip over your own shoes. Success was never guaranteed, but the entertainment value was always high. Of course, this all came with risks. If you were caught dabbling in love magic, you might find yourself the subject of some seriously judgmental gossip, or worse, an accusation of witchcraft. Viking communities could be surprisingly tolerant of magical dabbling, especially if it helped someone finally marry off that one awkward cousin. But step over the line, say, by causing someone's livestock to behave suspiciously, and you could face social exile, a ruined reputation, or, at the very least, a midnight visit from your target's angry mother. And then there was the small matter of side effects. If the object of your affections started acting strange, say, singing about you to the goats, or suddenly gifting you all their best spoons, people would likely blame it on elves, trolls, or just one of those things. You could always deny responsibility, but in a community where everyone shared a single bath and most secrets lasted about 8 minutes, plausible deniability was limited. The sagas are full of magical mishaps, spells gone wrong, rival enchantments colliding, and at least one story involving a love potion so powerful that 2 people spent a year arguing about turnips before realizing they were supposed to be married. For every successful magical romance, there were 3 others that ended in comedic disaster, legal trouble, or a suspiciously large bonfire behind the longhouse. Still, magic had its place. Whether as an act of desperation, a test of fate, or just a way to pass a long winter night, Vikings never entirely gave up on the possibility of a supernatural nudge. If you were bold, lucky, and able to withstand some side-eye from the local sheep, love spells offered one more route to Viking romance. High risk, high reward, and always a little bit mysterious. So, next time you feel unlucky in love, consider the Viking method. A sprinkle of herbs, a carved rune, and just enough plausible deniability to blame the elves when things go sideways. Because in the end, every great romance needs a little magic. And a backup story for when the cows start acting funny. If you are unfaithful, be prepared for public humiliation. Vikings loved a good shaming. The penalty for adultery could include fines, exile, or the much-dreaded being made into a saga anecdote. Let's be clear, if you were thinking about a secret affair in Viking society, you'd better have nerves of steel, a gift for creative storytelling, and a strong tolerance for cold shoulders. In a world where privacy was limited to the space behind a particularly wide cow, infidelity wasn't just risky. It was practically a community sport. If you got caught, the consequences weren't just between you and your spouse, they were for the entertainment of the entire longhouse, plus at least 3 neighbouring villages. The Norse loved a good scandal, and nothing livened up a long winter night like gossip about who was caught where, with whom, and under what circumstances. If the details were especially juicy, say, someone's best cloak was involved, or a prize sheep witnessed the tryst, you could expect the story to outlive you, your children, and at least 2 generations of goats. Public shaming was, in many ways, the Viking version of social media. Instead of a Twitter storm, you'd face a saga sung in your honour, recited for years at every feast, and updated with new embellishments each time it was told. What did public shaming actually look like? Well, it could be subtle. A few pointed jokes at the mead hall, a new nickname that everyone seemed to know except you, or mysterious stains appearing on your best tunic. Or it could be as dramatic as being summoned before the Thing, the Norse assembly, to answer charges of adultery. The assembly loved a spectacle, and you'd have to stand there while the whole community debated your guilt, your excuses, and whether your hair looked especially guilty that day. The penalties for infidelity were just as creative as the shaming. A wronged spouse could demand a fine, sometimes in silver, sometimes in livestock, and occasionally in whatever embarrassing personal items could be negotiated. Repeat offenders might face exile, which in the Viking world meant packing up your things, finding a new longhouse, and possibly inventing a new name. If you were unlucky enough to be both unfaithful and unpopular, you could end up immortalized as the villain in a local saga, doomed to be mocked by children and livestock alike. Of course, there were always some who tried to get away with it. Maybe you thought you could sneak out at night, blame your absence on the need to check the fences, or convince your spouse that you'd been taken by elves, a surprisingly common excuse. If you had the gift of the gab, you might attempt to spin the story so well that everyone started to doubt their own memory. But remember, Norse communities were small, longhouses were crowded, and there was always someone awake. Even the goats were suspicious. It didn't help that Viking poetry, so essential to their social lives, was weaponized in cases of infidelity. If you became the subject of a skald's verse, your misdeeds would be immortalized with all the subtlety of a horn blast at dawn. Here lies Bjorn, who strayed from his bed, now mocked by all, with turnips for bread. You could try to ride out the embarrassment, but odds were you'd never escape the new family nickname, something like 2 tunics or goat's regret. Sometimes, communities tried to resolve things quietly, perhaps with a settlement behind the longhouse or an agreement never to mention the incident again. But as every Viking knew, secrets didn't last long when everyone shared a single room and the walls were made of thin wood and wishful thinking. If you didn't want your private shame to become public legend, the best advice was simple: don't get caught. Or better yet, don't do it in the first place. So, the next time you feel tempted by forbidden romance, remember the Vikings. For them, a little indiscretion could snowball into a community-wide event, complete with fines, exile, and your very own saga subplot. In the land of the Longhouse, the only thing harder than keeping a secret was living it down once the sheep started talking. No antibiotics, no privacy, and a diet heavy in fermented fish. Combine that with occasional medical advice from the village wise woman, and you had the perfect recipe for misunderstanding basic biology, plus some really itchy nights. Let's take a soothing journey into the wild and occasionally alarming world of Viking sexual health, where the term preventative care usually meant hoping your rash would go away before the next feast. Forget modern clinics, pamphlets, or anything remotely resembling a wellness check. If you had a health question in the Viking Age, your best option was to ask your grandmother, the local herbalist, or, if you were feeling brave, the nearest blacksmith, who probably had opinions about everything, including medicine. Start with the basics. Hygiene was a challenge. Privacy was almost non-existent, so your entire family, plus 2 goats and a very judgmental chicken, probably knew if you started scratching. Baths were reserved for Saturday. Assuming you remembered, and the river wasn't frozen, that meant skin complaints and mysterious itches were basically a communal event. Everyone had them, everyone gossiped about them, and everyone had a favorite home remedy, ranging from pine sap to a strategically applied clump of moss. But let's say things got more serious. Maybe you picked up more than just a bad poem at the mead hall, or you and your spouse discovered some unpleasant souvenirs after a long winter. There were, of course, no antibiotics. The best you could hope for was a poultice of onions, garlic, and hope, administered by the wise woman who swore she once healed a horse with the same recipe. If you were especially lucky, she might add a spell or two, just in case the real cause was an angry spirit or a neighbor's curse. The understanding of sexual health was, let's be generous, theoretical. Disease was often explained as a punishment from the gods or a sign that you'd annoyed your ancestors. The cure? More prayers, less fun, and a stern warning about talking to strangers in the woods. Some ailments were considered so embarrassing that people would rather let them fester than risk becoming the punchline of the next village saga. If you did seek help, discretion was highly recommended, unless you enjoyed being the subject of advice from every relative with a theory and a jar of pickled beets. Contraception was another adventure in trial and error. Herbal remedies and folk techniques abounded, most of them about as reliable as reading runes upside down in a thunderstorm. Some women wore charms or amulets, others drank mysterious teas, and some just trusted in the power of denial. If none of that worked, there was always the blame the elves option, a surprisingly popular move, and one that worked just well enough to become tradition. Pregnancy, when it happened, was both celebrated and feared. The lack of prenatal care meant that every successful birth was a minor miracle, and every miscarriage or illness a family crisis. Women relied on each other, passing down advice and rituals designed to keep evil spirits at bay and ensure a healthy child. If anything went wrong, the wise woman would step in with her kit of herbs, charms, and occasionally a stern lecture about keeping your feet warm. Sexually transmitted infections? Nobody had a name for them, but everyone knew the symptoms. If your neighbor suddenly stopped coming to the mead hall and was seen limping around with a look of quiet despair, rumors would fly. Treatments varied from drinking vile brews to making offerings to the gods. Sometimes, just outlasting the illness was the only option, along with a silent vow to stay away from that one very charming sheep trader. So, the next time you reach for your modern remedies, spare a thought for the Vikings, people who faced health mysteries with a handful of moss, a hopeful chant, and the unwavering certainty that whatever was making you itchy, someone else in the longhouse probably had it too. Sleep well, and may your dreams be free of mysterious rashes, strange odors, and unsolicited advice from the local wise woman. Contraception, hope, prayer, and dubious folk remedies. Did Vikings have contraception? Sort of. There were herbal concoctions, amulets, and the classic pretend nothing happened and hope for the best. Not recommended by any modern standards. Let's wander down the winding and slightly overgrown path of Viking birth control, where every method sounded like a dare, and reliable meant it worked for my cousin's neighbour's aunt once, probably. If you've ever been thankful for modern science, spare a gentle thought for the Norse, who were forced to rely on equal parts hope, herbal tea, and a certain fatalistic acceptance of whatever happened next. Start with the basics. Knowledge of biology was, let's say, experimental. While the Vikings weren't totally clueless, they did not have sex ed classes, pamphlets, or even the medieval equivalent of awkward school assemblies. What they did have were village elders, the wisdom of the wise woman, and an entire oral tradition of home remedies, most of which were whispered in kitchens after the children had gone to sleep. The herbal approach was a favourite. Local plants like yarrow, juniper berries, wild carrot, and even tansy were brewed into mysterious teas or ground up and mixed with honey. Some of these may have had a mild effect. Others were just wishful thinking, and a few probably made you wish you'd stuck with abstinence. The flavour alone was enough to make anyone lose interest for a while. And, of course, no Viking herbal remedy was complete without a ritual. You might need to pick the plants at sunrise, recite a poem to Freya, and then drink your potion under the disapproving gaze of the family goat. Physical methods were also rumoured, though details are, mercifully, scarce. Amulets were worn to ward off pregnancy, carved with runes and blessed by the local seeress, often tied around the waist, wrist, or, for extra security, both. Some women carried small pouches of protective herbs, which might have worked as a sort of medieval placebo, if not on fertility, then at least on peace of mind. And then there was the oldest technique of all. Don't think about it. The Viking approach to unexpected pregnancy was, frequently, a mix of strategic denial and rapid problem-solving. If all else failed, you could always blame the elves, the weather, or the potent effects of last night's mead. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it resulted in a new cousin with an unusually vague birthday story. There was also a strong element of prayer and ritual. Appealing to the gods for protection, luck, or fertility, as needed, was standard. Offerings might be made to Freya, the goddess of love, or Frigg, the goddess of motherhood, just in case divine intervention was more effective than the herbal route. There are even stories of couples abstaining during certain phases of the moon, or after seeing bad omens, because you never knew what might tip the scales from safe to surprise. When accidents did happen, and, let's be honest, they happened a lot, the results were generally accepted as the will of the gods or the fate woven by the Norns, the Norse fates. Children were valued, but a large family was both a blessing and a logistical headache. More mouths to feed meant more hands for farm work, but also more competition for the last piece of smoked fish at breakfast. Extended families banded together, sometimes in the same longhouse, where the sound of crying babies was as common as the sound of snoring uncles. All told, Viking contraception was less about strict control and more about managing the chaos. Remedies were handed down through generations, with new ingredients and rules added every decade. If you wanted to guarantee results, the only sure method was, as one wise woman probably said, don't be in the same room. Practical? No. Historically accurate? Absolutely. So, the next time you pass a pharmacy or grumble about modern methods, remember the Vikings, people who navigated love, luck, and a truly wild garden of preventatives with grit, humour, and a lot of hope. If all else failed, there was always the classic, pretend nothing happened and hope for the best. Family was important, but paternity tests were not a thing. If you had kids, you raised them, or claimed they were descended from a god if they were particularly annoying. Norse dads. Inventing the "that's not my kid" defense centuries ahead of their time, step into the Viking longhouse, and you'll find a world where family ties are strong, The number of children running underfoot is always a little uncertain, and nobody seems overly bothered about tracking DNA. If you ask the average Norse parent, who's the father, you'd probably get a shrug, a sideways glance at the neighbour's beard, and a story about how young Bjorn is definitely descended from Thor, at least on his good days. The Viking concept of family was as practical as it was flexible. Children were valued for their future usefulness, extra hands for farming, potential warriors, and, if you played your social cards right, living insurance policies for your old age. Having lots of kids was a blessing, at least until mealtime, when the true cost of raising a small army became clear. But while family was everything, exact parentage was negotiable. In a world without birth certificates, and with a communal sleeping arrangement that made privacy a mythical concept, it wasn't always clear who fathered whom. Sure, there were rumours, knowing looks, and the occasional suspicious resemblance, but Vikings were nothing if not adaptable. If a child showed up in the longhouse, you raised them. If they turned out to be troublesome, you simply reminded everyone of their godly origins, an excellent excuse for wild hair or an uncanny knack for finding trouble. Mothers were the anchors of the Viking household. They managed the children, the cooking, the animals, and the never-ending cycle of cleaning up after both. If a child was born out of wedlock or showed up under mysterious circumstances, the mother's family would usually absorb the extra mouth with little more than a raised eyebrow and a new assignment of chores. Children were useful, after all, and if you didn't know whose they were, you just made sure they could herd goats and keep quiet at the dinner table. For fathers, things were equally flexible. Officially, you claimed your own, but there was also a certain camaraderie in not asking too many questions. A wise Viking dad might simply accept the new addition, teach them how to swing an axe, and brag about their strength at the next thing. If a child grew up to be famous, or at least notorious, it was always better to be able to say you'd had a hand in their upbringing. If they turned out badly, well, that's why you had a backup saga involving Odin or a wandering bear. Education was another group effort. Children learned from everyone: mothers, fathers, older siblings, neighbours, and the occasional friendly skald who stopped by to tell stories. Boys were taught to hunt, farm, and most importantly, fight with at least one weapon. Girls learned everything their mothers did and more, since running a Viking household required tactical genius, strong arms, and nerves of steel. If a child showed promise, they might be fostered out to another family, cementing alliances and giving them new skills, and hopefully fewer bad habits. And when it came to inheritance, things got even more creative. Norse law gave children rights regardless of how or where they were born, so long as someone stood up and acknowledged them at the thing. This meant fewer family feuds and more opportunities for everyone to argue about who got the good cow and who was stuck with the dented shield. Sometimes the real winner was the child who could recite the most poetry at dinner. In the end, Viking parenting was less about strict paternity and more about survival, teamwork, and making the most of whatever the gods, or the neighbours, sent your way. If you could keep the kids alive, teach them a good saga, and avoid any major scandals, you were already ahead of the curve. And if all else failed, just tell them they were descended from Thor and hope for the best. If you thought Vikings weren't into romance, you haven't read their poetry. It's all metaphors, awkward sea imagery, and an alarming number of references to oars and boats. Tinder bios, Viking edition. You might think the Viking world was all about blood, sweat, and heroic last stands. But even the roughest Norse raider had a softer side. And sometimes that side wrote poetry. Norse sagas and skaldic verses weren't just about epic battles and family feuds. Hidden among tales of axe-swinging mayhem were lines that could make even the hardiest shield maiden blush. You know, the kind of verses that might start with a tribute to someone's longship and end with a suggestive wink across the mead hall. The skalds, those wandering poets and court entertainers, were the original Viking influencers. Their job was to immortalize great deeds, settle feuds, and, occasionally, sneak in a little bedroom banter. The Vikings didn't write love sonnets in the style of Shakespeare. Instead, they went for extended metaphors that could get pretty creative and more than a little confusing if you weren't in on the joke. If a poem compared you to a storm-tossed prow or described your beauty as brighter than the foam on the fjord, you were being flirted with, whether you knew it or not. Of course, these verses rarely spelled things out directly. Vikings loved a good euphemism, and the more layered the metaphor, the better. Oars and boats were just the beginning. There were poetic references to ploughing the field, casting the net, and stirring the cauldron, and, in one infamous case, checking the sails for wind. If you got a poem written about you, congratulations. You'd either inspired the deepest passions or at least provided the skald with new material for next week's feast. Not all Viking poetry was high art. Some was downright cheeky, composed late at night after a little too much mead. Picture a dim longhouse, half the family already snoring, and a slightly tipsy skald trying to rhyme love with cabbage stew. These were the poems whispered to sweethearts in shadowy corners, or sometimes carved into the beams of the longhouse for future generations to giggle over. If you found an old rune scratched into your bedpost, odds are it wasn't a declaration of undying love, it was the medieval equivalent of a bathroom stall confession. But poetry wasn't just for fun. In the high-stakes game of Viking romance, a well-timed verse could win you favours, patch up quarrels, or signal your intentions to the entire village. Public poetry was risky, though. If your metaphors were too suggestive, you risked being mocked or imitated by rival poets, and if your subject was already spoken for, you might find yourself on the wrong end of an axe. The best skalds knew how to walk the line, flirty enough to keep people interested, vague enough to avoid a lawsuit. Erotic poetry could also be weaponized. If you wanted to insult a rival, nothing was more devastating than a carefully crafted verse, implying they weren't up to Viking standards in the romance department. These poetic duels could get surprisingly heated, with reputations and future marriage prospects hanging in the balance. Losing a poetry battle was bad. Becoming the main character in an embarrassing saga was worse. So, if you think your modern dating profile is clever, imagine wooing someone with 3 lines about sailing the fjords and a dramatic reference to stormy seas. Viking romance was subtle, bold, and always wrapped in a thick cloak of metaphor. If you got the reference, you were in. If not, at least you could laugh it off over another horn of mead. In the end, Viking erotica proves one universal truth. No matter the century, people will find a way to flirt, tease, and immortalize their crushes, even if it means comparing them to a ship, a storm, or a suspiciously enthusiastic oar. Love triangles were dangerous. If your affair was discovered, you might end up in a legal duel, armed with axes and a burning sense of romantic regret. It's all fun and games until someone loses an ear. Viking society may have thrived on heroic sagas, but behind every epic tale was at least one disastrous love triangle and a generous helping of jealousy. With long, dark winters, communal living, and a healthy dose of competitive poetry, it was only a matter of time before hearts and axes started flying. If you're picturing candlelit glances and secret rendezvous under the aurora, adjust your expectations. In the north, a love triangle often meant public spectacle, legal battles, and the ever-present risk of accidentally insulting someone's second cousin. When jealousy reared its horned helmet, things could escalate fast. Vikings had a reputation for passionate tempers and equally passionate grudges. If your romantic interest wandered, or you suspected that your spouse was spending too much time helping the neighbor churn butter, the proper thing to do was start an argument. This argument would be very public, ideally at the mead hall, where everyone could watch, comment, and place bets. If shouting didn't solve the problem, there was always the legal duel, or holmgang, a formalized, semi-civilized way to settle disputes with weapons. Yes, you could challenge your rival to single combat, witnessed by the entire community, with an agreed set of rules and a definite risk of someone leaving with fewer ears than they arrived with. It wasn't all death and drama. Sometimes the duel ended with bruises, a damaged ego, and a grudging handshake. Sometimes, though, things got fatal, especially if the scolds were taking notes for the next saga installment. Women weren't passive bystanders in these dramas. Saga heroines sometimes incited or mediated disputes, wielding words as sharply as any sword. A jealous wife might compose a cutting verse, spread rumors, or even convince her relatives to take sides. If she was especially bold, she could call for a thing, a community assembly, to air her grievances in public and seek compensation. The result? An avalanche of gossip, a renewed market for poetic insults, and at least one very awkward dinner. Love triangles didn't always end in violence. Sometimes the threat of public shaming was enough to cool everyone's passions. Viking society had strict laws about adultery, and being exposed as the other person could mean fines, exile, or a starring role in every dinner table joke for the next decade. For those with enough status or luck, a discreet settlement might be arranged. Gifts were exchanged, apologies made, and everyone agreed never to mention the incident again, at least until the next festival. And let's not forget the power of the scolds. If your romantic misadventures caught the attention of a poet, they'd be immortalized in verse, complete with creative metaphors and just enough ambiguity to keep everyone guessing. Having your love triangle become the subject of a saga was a mixed blessing. You might be remembered forever, but mostly as a cautionary tale. The emotional stakes were real, but so was the practical side. Inheritance, property, and family honor were tangled up with love and jealousy. If you lost a duel or were caught in an affair, your standing in the community could collapse overnight. Marriage alliances were serious business, and a scandal could mean losing land, support, or your place at the next feast. If the drama got out of hand, there was always the option of packing up and heading west to start over in Iceland, land of fresh starts and, presumably, fewer vengeful exes. So, if you ever find yourself grumbling about modern relationship drama, imagine the high-stakes world of Viking romance, where jealous rivals challenged each other with axes, love triangles could spark actual legal proceedings, and the local poet might turn your heartbreak into the next great saga. In the end, Viking love was a contact sport, and sometimes the only winner was the goat who got to keep the peace. Viking masculinity was about fighting, farming, and sometimes weaving suspiciously good blankets. Women could wield power, manage property, and outwit most men at a drinking contest. Gender was complicated, pronouns were less so. Step into the Viking age and forget everything you've learned from modern gender stereotypes. Here, being masculine didn't just mean carrying a big axe or growing a dramatic beard. Sure, the ideal Viking man could fight and farm and probably recite a saga or two while standing on one leg, but he was also expected to sow his own sails, milk the family cow, and survive months at sea without complaining about chafing. If he also happened to be a whiz with a loom, so much the better. Masculinity was a moving target, somewhere between fearsome warrior and emergency seamstress. Women, meanwhile, were hardly background extras. They managed households that were miniature empires, complete with livestock, food storage, and the world's most complex family politics. A Viking woman was often the glue that held everything together. She supervised the servants, controlled the keys to the storeroom, power move, and could negotiate a dowry with the best of them. If she didn't like the terms, she was fully capable of out-debating, out-drinking, and, when necessary, outwitting the men. She might even settle a dispute by quoting legal code. If your wife could recite the family lineage backward, you'd better not lose an argument about whose turn it was to churn the butter. Viking society was practical to its core. Tasks were divided up by necessity, not always by gender. Men were expected to raid and trade, yes, but also to keep the farm running while the women handled the market, the household, and occasionally the neighbors' wandering goats. Children learned early that everyone worked, and helping out was not optional. By the time you could walk, You knew how to fetch water and avoid the rooster with anger management issues. There was a cultural ideal of manliness called drengskaper, which mixed courage, generosity, and a readiness to defend your honor or your best tunic. But being accused of unmanly behavior was more about social standing than actual gender identity. If you lost your temper in public, got caught cheating at games, or wrote really bad poetry, expect to be the subject of much snickering at the next feast. Meanwhile, a shield maiden, a woman who fought alongside the men, was both feared and respected, often more for her wit than her weapon skills. Pronouns and gender identity? Surprisingly chill. Old Norse grammar had masculine and feminine words, but everyday life was too busy to police pronoun usage. If you could do the job, wield the broom, or survive the winter, you were accepted. Anyone who insisted on rigid gender roles was likely to be gently mocked, then handed a stack of wet laundry. Even clothing was a mixed bag. Men and women both wore tunics, cloaks, and a dizzying variety of brooches. Jewelry was for everyone. If you had it, you wore it. Embroidery and bright colours were status symbols, not declarations of gender. The best-dressed Viking in the room might just be a sheep, but the second best was just as likely to be a well-respected matriarch or the local blacksmith. Of course, there were expectations and rules. A man who shirked his duties or showed cowardice might find himself the subject of cutting verses, never good for your reputation. Women who pushed the boundaries too far could face gossip or even legal trouble, unless, of course, their family was rich enough to ignore the haters. For the most part, though, Vikings valued competence, loyalty, and the ability to survive another winter. Everything else was negotiable. So next time someone tries to tell you the past was simple, remember the Vikings. Masters of flexible gender roles, accidental feminists, and the original multitaskers. In their world, what mattered most was keeping the farm running, the children fed, and the neighbors mildly envious. Masculine, feminine, or somewhere in between, if you could handle a longhouse full of drama, you had everyone's respect. Being a Viking meant leaving home for months, sometimes years. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, or at least gives your spouse more time to reconsider their options. The Viking long-distance relationship, mostly just long. Picture this: you've just gotten married, settled into the rhythm of life in the longhouse, and finally figured out which cousin you're not supposed to flirt with at feasts. Just as you're getting comfortable, your spouse casually announces, "By the way, I'm off to Ireland. Should be back by next harvest, or the one after that." If you were hoping for quality time, shared chores, and deep conversations by the fire, you'd have better luck with the family goat. Viking society was built on mobility. Trade, raids, and exploration weren't just hobbies, they were survival strategies, and sometimes even love strategies. If your village was running low on eligible bachelors, or you'd heard that the Swedes had better hair, a well-timed voyage could change your romantic prospects entirely. Of course, travel came with its own challenges: storms, rival warbands, seasickness, and the very real danger of returning home to discover that your spouse had taken up with your best friend, or worse, with the neighbor who made superior turnip stew. Long absences put a particular strain on relationships, but the Vikings handled it with their signature blend of fatalism, poetry, and practicality. Letters? Not a thing. Scented love notes? Only if you counted the lingering odor of your old tunic left hanging by the hearth. The best you could hope for was a carved token, a shared song, or the promise that your spouse would pour you a horn of mead if, when, you eventually returned alive. For those who stayed behind, the waiting game was a test of patience, faith, and community surveillance. Every time a ship sailed into the fjord, half the village would rush to the shore, hoping for news, or just to see who'd come back taller and who'd come back with suspiciously shiny new jewelry. Reunions were equal parts joy, relief, and frantic catch-up. How was the weather in Miklagard? Did you remember to bring back that comb I wanted? And by the way, little Bjorn has started reciting saga verses at the cows. It wasn't all uncertainty and heartbreak. For some, travel was a chance to strengthen bonds by exchanging gifts from distant lands. Amber from the Baltic, silk from the East, or a comb liberated from a particularly grumpy Anglo-Saxon. If you played your cards right, your return was greeted with feasting, flattery, and maybe even a welcome home poem. If you didn't, you might find your place in the bed replaced by a sheep. Vikings were practical that way. Absence did make some hearts grow fonder, at least until the next eligible newcomer rode into port. For the Vikings, monogamy was the ideal, but reality often involved a little improvisation. Sometimes new relationships blossomed while partners were away, especially if no one was keeping strict count of return dates. Children born in their father's absence were usually welcomed, though the story of their conception might be as flexible as Viking morals and as creative as their poetry. If you asked whose child it was, you might get a shrug, a saga, or a list of gods who'd allegedly stopped by during a thunderstorm. In the end, Viking long-distance love was an exercise in endurance and adaptability. Couples learned to treasure their moments together, however fleeting, and to rely on their extended families and communities to help keep everything running, or at least not burning down. If you could survive months apart, with only rumors and questionable poetry to sustain you, you could handle just about anything, especially reunion feasts that doubled as family therapy and public performance art. So, next time you complain about a long-distance relationship, remember the Vikings, navigating stormy seas, shifting loyalties, and the constant risk of coming home to find the livestock have moved into your spot. In their world, love was as enduring as the north wind, blustery, unpredictable, and, when you were lucky, waiting for you by the fire with a bowl of slightly burnt porridge. Not every raid ended in chaos. Sometimes Vikings settled, married locals, and tried to blend in. Nothing says true love like adopting your new in-laws' strange food and pretending you like it. It's easy to imagine the Vikings as nothing but axe-wielding marauders, storming the coasts, setting things on fire, and then vanishing back over the horizon. But history is always more complicated, and so were Viking relationships. Sometimes, after the chaos, something remarkable happened. People fell in love. Maybe it was the thrill of danger. Maybe the local ale was stronger than expected. Or maybe, after years of sleeping in a hayloft with 50 of your closest relatives, you just really liked the idea of a new longhouse and a change of scenery. For some Vikings, the end of a raid was the beginning of a new chapter. Instead of heading home, they chose to settle down, on purpose. Maybe the local land was rich, the prospects were good, or, most likely, someone in the village caught their eye and made them rethink a lifetime of raiding and rowing. Intermarriage wasn't just a happy accident, it was a practical way to secure peace, property, and the goodwill of the neighbors, plus a reliable source of future dinner invitations. Settling down as a former raider came with its own set of challenges. For starters, you had to win over your new in-laws, no small feat when you'd just helped liberate half their pantry. Diplomacy skills were suddenly just as important as your axe. The first step in blending in? Learning to enjoy local food. Whether it was pickled fish, unfamiliar root vegetables, or mysterious stews with ingredients you'd rather not question, showing enthusiasm at dinner was vital. Smile politely, say delicious, and try not to think about what your mother back home would say. Of course, blending cultures was more than just swapping recipes. Vikings brought their own traditions, feasts, stories, and a healthy respect for well-insulated buildings. Local communities had their customs. From wedding rituals to festivals you were suddenly expected to attend, bonus points if you remembered the right song lyrics. The result was a blend of languages, beliefs, and ways of life that made for some truly entertaining misunderstandings. Imagine trying to explain to your new spouse why you needed a goat in the bedroom for warmth, or why you thought it was normal to eat breakfast in total silence, except for the occasional saga recitation. For children born of these unions, life could be especially interesting. You got the best, and sometimes weirdest, of both worlds: Viking storytelling skills, local fashion sense, and at least 3 different types of porridge. These new families were often at the center of local life, bridging the gap between cultures and acting as peacekeepers whenever someone's uncle started telling the "How I Met Your Mother" during a raid story again at the feast. Blending cultures wasn't always smooth sailing. Old grudges died hard, and neighbors sometimes needed years to forgive, and even longer to forget that time you accidentally set the barn on fire. But intermarriage created real connections, bonds of affection, loyalty, and shared chores. The local language picked up Norse words. Viking kids grew up eating new foods, and longhouses started to feel more like home. Over time, entire regions changed. Place names, folk tales, even religious practices shifted as people intermarried and settled down. Some Viking settlers eventually became indistinguishable from their neighbors, except, perhaps, for their stubbornness in insisting that a proper meal always includes smoked fish. Love and family made raiders into locals, and strangers into kin. So, the next time you hear about a Viking raid, remember that not every story ended with fire and plunder. Sometimes, the biggest surprise was what happened after. Marriages, blended families, and the creation of communities richer and weirder than anything the raiders had expected. True love, after all, is about more than just surviving battle. It's about learning to appreciate pickled turnips, understanding your in-laws' sense of humor, and, above all, knowing when to put down your axe and pick up a spoon. Finally, as age set in, Vikings told wild stories about their youthful exploits, most of which were, frankly, exaggerated for effect. Your love life might have been awkward, brief, and full of disappointment, but in the saga, you were a legend, or at least you tried to be. The longhouse grows quieter as the years go by. The endless clatter of children, the banging of shields, and the awkward tension of courtship are replaced by the slow creak of wooden beams and the steady hum of stories retold for the 100th time. This is the Viking version of retirement. Sitting by the central hearth, sharing a drinking horn with old friends and at least 3 generations of family members, and spinning tales so grand even the goats roll their eyes. Memory in Viking old age was a flexible thing. Maybe you once fumbled your first proposal, or fell in love with a visiting merchant who turned out to be someone's uncle twice removed. Maybe your honeymoon was mostly hay and apologizing for your snoring. But give it a few decades, and suddenly those awkward moments became the foundation of legend. Your romantic misadventures were retold with extra drama, new plot twists, and a surprising number of poetic metaphors about longships and stormy seas. The trick to a good saga was simple. Never let facts get in the way of a memorable story. That ill-advised gift of a goat's foot? Now, it's an ancient fertility ritual passed down from Odin himself. That time you tripped over your own tunic and lost a duel over a love triangle? In the saga version, it was a cunning ruse to distract your rival and win the heart of the most beautiful shield maiden in the fjord. Even if your youthful love life was more confused sheep and missed signals than grand passion, by the time you were old, you were the undisputed champion of the mead hall anecdote. Of course, it wasn't just about personal glory. These stories were important. They taught younger generations about the dangers of jealousy, the value of loyalty, and the reality that love was rarely as simple as the poets promised. Grandparents would offer stern warnings, usually disguised as hilarious disasters, about the perils of chasing someone else's spouse, drinking one too many love potions, or confusing the meanings of runes at a crucial moment. If the young people were wise, they listened. If not, at least they got a good laugh. Some stories even entered the official record, recited at feasts or passed down in poetic form. Maybe your own saga got embroidered into a tapestry, or became the basis for an epic verse that lived on long after your actual accomplishments faded into memory. Local skalds, poets, took inspiration from these true stories, adding embellishments until even you weren't sure what really happened. If you protested, everyone would just wink and hand you another cup of mead. With age also came a softer perspective. rivalries that once seemed deadly serious, mellowed into jokes. Former rivals might swap stories about the same love interest, each claiming a different victory and agreeing that, in the end, nobody really understood what anyone else was thinking anyway. As for spouses, the bickering of youth was replaced by shared amusement at life's unpredictability. Remember when you tried that love spell and turned the beer green? You're lucky I kept you around after that. In a world without written diaries or photographs, these stories were a living record. They gave meaning to the years, laughter to the nights, and a sense that even the messiest love life could have a heroic ending, at least in the retelling. So, if your Viking love life was more comedy than epic, take heart. In the end, the only thing better than being young and foolish was growing old enough to tell everyone it was all part of the legend. When it came to romance, Vikings didn't have scented candles or Marvin Gaye. They had mead, strong, sticky, and prone to causing confessions you'd regret by morning. The local mead hall was less romantic bistro and more shouting contest in a barn. If you managed to flirt across the table without getting splashed by ale or challenged to an arm wrestling match, you were doing better than most. Intimacy here meant finding a shadowy corner where nobody was currently brawling, or at least nobody was throwing axes. Imagine stepping into a Viking mead hall on a chilly evening, fur cloak around your shoulders, hopeful look in your eye, and absolutely zero expectation of peace and quiet. The air is thick with smoke, laughter, and the heady aroma of roasted meat mingling with the less heady aroma of damp wool and unwashed warriors. Flickering torches provide mood lighting if you squint hard enough. There's no playlist of slow jams, just the rise and fall of rowdy singing, the occasional slurred toast, and the crash of a mug meeting the floor or a rival's head. Mead is the social glue holding it all together. The drink flows freely and so do the stories, each more exaggerated than the last. Emboldened by drink, the shyest farmhand might declare their undying love to the baker's daughter, or at least challenge her to a wrestling match by the fire. If someone leans in a little too close, you're never sure if it's flirtation, drunkenness, or just a desperate bid to be heard over the noise. Small talk is an extreme sport, and witty banter must be delivered at top volume. Physical space is at a premium. Tables are crowded, benches are narrow, and the only way to avoid eavesdropping is to speak in ancient runic code, which is, conveniently, also a great way to test someone's intelligence. If you want to get close to your crush, your best bet is to retreat to the far end of the hall, somewhere near the barrels and away from the worst of the chaos. Here, between half-empty jugs and the warm bodies of sleeping dogs, a little privacy might finally be possible. For the brave, or foolish, dancing provides another chance at connection. Forget delicate waltzes. Viking dancing is more of a group stomp, occasionally interrupted by someone slipping on a spilled turnip. The energy is infectious, the rhythm questionable, and the odds of a romantic moment increase with every cup of mead consumed. If you can survive a night of this without falling over, or getting propositioned by someone's very persistent aunt, you might have found yourself a match. Of course, not all intimacy was public. For those bold enough, slipping outside into the cold Nordic air for a midnight stroll could be just the thing. Under the stars, with only the distant echo of the mead hall brawl for company, whispered promises and stolen kisses took on a new kind of magic. Just don't linger too long, or you risk being the subject of tomorrow's gossip. Or, worse, missing the last slice of roast pork. Back inside, the chaos continues. Mead-fueled confessions are blurted out, secret crushes revealed, and more than one couple ends the evening arm in arm, or face down on the same bench. What the Viking mead hall lacked in romantic ambiance, it made up for in sheer unpredictability. Every night was a chance at love, or at least at making a memorable mistake you could later retell as a grand saga of affection, ale, and questionable decisions. So, next time you complain about bad restaurant lighting or noisy bars, remember the Vikings, people who found romance in the chaos, passion in the noise, and intimacy in the eye of the mead-fueled storm. No candles, no playlist, just the glow of fire, the promise of another round, and the hope that tonight's love story wouldn't end with a pie to the face. Want to show your affection Viking style? Forget roses or chocolates. The hottest gifts were animal pelts, carved spoons, or that one sword you found after last summer's raid. Proposals sometimes involved dramatic gestures like tossing a seal's tooth at your beloved's feet or solemnly handing over a lock of slightly greasy hair. If your chosen partner didn't immediately run away, congratulations. It was a match made in Valhalla, or at least tolerated in the Longhouse. Let's be honest, romantic gestures have always been a little awkward, but the Vikings truly took it to another level. When you lived in a world where every family had at least 3 sheep, a pile of dried fish, and a suspiciously large axe collection, creativity in courtship wasn't just encouraged, it was necessary. After all, what do you give the person who already has their own comb and a fur cloak? Something memorable, of course. Animal pelts were a classic. If you really liked someone, you might spend days hunting a particularly stubborn fox or seal just so you could drape their hide around your future spouse's shoulders. Not only was this practical, because, again, cold, it also served as a subtle way of saying, I care about you not freezing to death. The more exotic the animal, the better. Extra points if the gift came with an elaborate story about how you heroically tracked it through a blizzard, or at least tripped over it near the barn. For those less inclined to brave the wilderness, there were always spoons. Vikings loved carved wooden spoons, and nothing said lifelong commitment like a utensil painstakingly whittled by hand, preferably with your initials, a few runes, and maybe an ambiguous animal carving or two. Some spoons became family heirlooms, passed down for generations with increasingly exaggerated tales about their romantic origins. This, my dear, is the spoon your great-great-grandfather gave to your great-great-grandmother after he bested a bear and 2 uncles in an arm wrestling contest. Or maybe it was just after breakfast. Nobody remembers. Then there were the gifts with more controversial origins. A sword acquired during a raid was a bold statement of intent. Presenting such a treasure was not just a show of affection but also a sort of informal dowry. If you really wanted to impress, you might hand over a blade with a blood-stained past and a legend attached. It was the Viking equivalent of giving your heart, only much heavier and, if not handled properly, a little dangerous. Of course, proposals needed drama. Forget getting down on one knee. Kneeling in a muddy longhouse was never a good look. Instead, you might toss a seal's tooth or a carved amulet at your intended's feet, a subtle message to everyone in the room that you were officially interested. Some brave souls would solemnly snip a lock of hair, hopefully their own, bind it with coloured thread, and hand it over like a charm. Bonus points for hair that had survived 3 winters without a lice outbreak. If your beloved didn't immediately run for the hills, or worse, return your love token with a sarcastic poem, there was hope. Acceptance of the gift was often as good as a yes. Maybe they would return the gesture with a ribbon, a woven belt, or a slightly alarming piece of jewelry made from animal teeth. Suddenly, everyone in the longhouse was watching, offering advice, or quietly betting on whether this match would last longer than last year's goat cheese. And the celebrations didn't stop there. After a successful proposal, there might be a feast, or at least a round of mead and a slightly off-key song. The skalds, poets, would be ready to immortalize your odd courtship in verse, possibly with more detail about the spoon than your actual love story. So, next time you complain about the price of roses or the awkwardness of Valentine's Day, spare a thought for the Vikings, masters of the dramatic, champions of the practical, and proof that love can be forged from the unlikeliest tokens. If you got a seal's tooth and a wooden spoon, you knew it was real. Or at the very least, you were about to star in the next family saga. Even love needed approval from the gods. Viking couples sometimes sought blessings from Freya, goddess of love, or Thor, god of thunder and suspiciously loud bedroom noises. Sacrifices ranged from a simple prayer to the mildly alarming slaughter of a goat, which really set the mood for romance. Nothing says everlasting devotion like a priestess chanting next to a pile of questionable entrails while your new spouse tries not to faint. Viking romance was never just a private affair. The gods were always watching, sometimes approving, sometimes shaking their immortal heads. If you wanted your marriage to prosper, your love to last, or your attempts at seduction to go anywhere other than awkwardly sideways, you needed more than just a fancy spoon or a dramatic proposal. You needed divine intervention, or at least the appearance of it. The process usually started with a visit to a local temple or a hastily assembled altar at home. Offerings were made to Freyja, the goddess of love, fertility, and please help me survive this wedding night. Her blessings were especially sought after by hopeful couples and desperate mothers-in-law alike. If you were feeling especially bold or had a thunderous sense of humor, you might throw in a word or two to Thor, just in case your union needed extra energy, or your spouse's snoring reached mythic proportions. And then came the rituals. Forget scented candles and soft music. Viking romance was celebrated with chanting, singing, and, if you were lucky, a communal feast afterward. The centerpiece was often a sacrifice. Sometimes this was a symbolic gesture, a bit of mead poured onto the earth, a handful of grain, or a simple wooden idol left at a sacred grove. Other times, things got more visceral. A goat or sheep might be offered up to ensure fertility, prosperity, and the gods' good humor. The priestess, or, occasionally, a particularly enthusiastic uncle, would interpret the entrails for signs and omens, while everyone tried to look like they understood what was happening. For the newlyweds, standing beside a pile of steaming, slightly ominous goat bits, the moment was equal parts terrifying and surreal. There was always that one cousin who fainted at the sight, or the brave but deeply unlucky guest who ended up wearing the ceremonial bloodstain for the rest of the night. And yet, in its own strange way, the ritual brought everyone together. Nothing says family bonding quite like watching your aunt try to chase a runaway chicken out of the sacred circle while your new spouse tries not to look too traumatized. Rituals varied from village to village. Some places preferred the drama of midnight ceremonies under the aurora, while others kept it simple with a morning prayer and a communal breakfast. Either way, the gods' blessings were seen as crucial insurance. With their help, you might avoid bad luck, sickness, or the ultimate curse, a spouse who couldn't cook. These rituals were also about building community. Everyone, from the oldest grandmother to the youngest goat, got involved. There were stories told, songs sung, and at least one awkward speech by an uncle who'd had too much mead. The priestess would often end the ceremony with a rousing invocation, calling on the gods to bless the couple with fruitful unions, many healthy children, and an absolute minimum of marital squabbling. If all went well, the couple left the sacred site with a sense of relief and a lingering odor of goat, a scent guaranteed to fade, eventually. For days afterward, they'd be congratulated, teased, and given advice by everyone who'd witnessed the event, most of it questionable, all of it well-meaning. So, the next time you worry about impressing your in-laws or making your wedding memorable, remember the Vikings, people for whom romance was a public performance, divine approval a must, and no celebration complete without a chorus of blessings and a few stray entrails. True love, in the Viking world, meant making it through the ritual with your dignity and your lunch intact, and trusting that the gods at least were on your side. So tonight, as you burrow into your clean sheets, maybe with only a faint whiff of laundry detergent instead of smoked fish and goat, take a moment to reflect on your modern blessings. You survived the longhouse, its symphony of snoring, gossip, and cows. You navigated Viking romance, with all its mead-fueled poetry, accidental proposals, and the ever-present threat of being shamed in verse for your questionable dance moves. You learned that even the fiercest warriors could be undone by a badly timed gift of animal teeth or a love spell that mostly resulted in itchy rashes. But behind the laughter and absurdity, There's something stubbornly impressive about these people. They braved icy seas, creaky longships, and the world's most judgmental grandmothers, all while searching for connection, awkward, hopeful, and as full of drama as any modern dating app. In a world without privacy, antibiotics, or a reliable deodorant, they managed to build families, forge new societies, and even find the energy to argue over whose turn it was to patch the roof. So, as you close your eyes tonight, maybe whisper a small thank you to your Viking ancestors, because history may be itchy, loud, and occasionally scandalous, but it's also a story of resilience, resourcefulness, and, despite everything, hope. Sleep well, knowing your greatest bedtime danger is the gentle hum of your fan and maybe the neighbor's cat, not a goat with boundary issues. And if you enjoyed drifting through history with me tonight, feel free to like, subscribe, or just drop a comment about your favorite segment. But only if you actually enjoyed it. May your dreams be free of saga drama, and may your sleep be as deep as a Viking after a long night in the mead hall. Good night.